About 2 years ago, I worked at a movie store inside a mall. I've had tons of strange experiences with customers, but this one definitely tops them off. I was 20 at the time. This guy was over 6 feet, late 40s, very hefty, and always had this weird zombified expression on his face. He came in about once a week. One of my coworkers had even warned me about him, how he was a little off, but I still treated him with as much respect as I did everyone else. One day, he came in, and we talked for a bit, but it got a little awkward, and I kept trying to end the conversation and look busy by taking items behind the counter. He stood there in silence, watching me for about 20 minutes, and then finally left. A few days later, he comes back in and walks up to me, holding a large container. He says,
"I made 4 pounds of enchiladas at home today, just for you. I remembered that you like Mexican food."
I don't remember at all telling him I liked it, but I do know that I went to the Mexican restaurant across the way every lunch break. I just politely accepted it and put it in the back office. I was convinced he used his jizz for it. Another few days later, he came back in and had a drawing for me of a dragon. Now, I love dragons, but I'd never told him that. This drawing looked like it took hours to make, and at this point I was a little freaked out. I had him leave it on the counter so I could just throw it away later. Later on, I was given about a week vacation. During that week, I had cut my hair about 12 inches. The day I came back, I got a shift with my manager. I told her all about the guy, and immediately she was weirded out for me. No shit, a few minutes later, I see the dude walking around the mall. He was going towards the exits and didn't look at me once. My manager tells me to go to the back office. I go and wait until she comes to get me. And when she does, she tells me I need to make a report to mall security immediately. Apparently, when I ran back there, he turned around to come in and walked all throughout the store. When she asked him if he needed help with something, he said,
"Can't believe she cut her hair,"
and briskly walked out. I go to the mall security office to make reports, and we went through all these videos from the cameras of when the guy came to visit me. But there was one video that really stood out. It still sends chills throughout my body just thinking about it. The video shows him pull into the parking lot of the mall, and about 3 minutes later, I arrive. This was really early in the morning, and no customers were here yet, but there were cars in the lot. I didn't notice him at all. It shows me walking towards the entrance, and him following me. Right as I opened the entrance door, the man started sprinting towards me. It shows him stop and just stand in front of the door, watching me through the glass, walk a little further away. He begins walking normally inside the mall. I never noticed him behind me. The part really fucked me up. It was like watching the last footage before a kidnapping or murder on Dateline or something. The video gave the security every reason to ban him from the mall, and they did. They later told me, when they gave him a background check, he had 4 counts of having CP on his person and was on probation. When I was 16, my parents and I moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I was soon hired at an Italian restaurant as a busboy. On my very first night, I was busy cleaning tables in the dining area when I was motioned by a table. At the table were 2 men. I would say they were both in their late 30s, dressed like fairly typical middle-class guys. Earlier, when I would pass by their table, I had noticed they were sitting very still without conversation and didn't seem very animated. Anyway, I go to their table as requested. The man who motioned me gestured to lean in closer to him. I assume he wanted to ask me to get his server or needed something. So, I bend slightly forwards, and he asks me this question softly.
"Have you ever had your initials carved into your forehead?"
In hindsight, I should have said something snarky like, "Well, not that I can remember," or, "Does it look like it?" But I was too taken aback by such a random and weird question. I know I can be clueless when it comes to social cues or jokes, so I chuckled awkwardly and searched his face for a sign of humor, but all I got was a blank stare. His friend or partner was silent and didn't even look at me. I think I shook my head and walked away, completely baffled. I walked into the kitchen and found the server of that table. I told her what happened and asked what was wrong with those guys. Oh, yeah, I don't know, but they're fucking weird. Regardless, I continued my duties and cleaned tables. I tried avoiding that table, but the men remained there for quite a while, just as inanimate as before. I don't even recall them eating anything. Maybe they did when I was working around the restaurant. When I was cleaning a table near them, the same man motioned me over once again. I was torn. I really didn't want to repeat the same experience, but I was afraid to say no to a customer. It was my first night on the job, and I didn't want a customer to complain to my manager, saying that I ignored them. So I went over to the table. Again, he wanted me to lean close so he could tell me something. I don't know why I did. He said,
Have you ever had two men pin you down, grab your throats, and...
But that was it. That's all I gave him. I immediately proceeded to nope right away from those guys. I'm a gay man, but nothing about his proposition seemed hot or sexually suggestive, like they wanted to hook up. It all felt very wrong to me. I'm not sure if they were really high on something, but the flat deadbeat tone of his voice and their blank stares really unsettled me. I went immediately to the general manager, who kind of shrugged it off. I worked until 2 a.m., and as ridiculous as it sounds, I had to ask the bartender just to watch me get back to my car safely in the dark parking lot. I tell a lot of people this story, and while it is bizarre and funny when I explain it, I was disturbed by the encounter that evening. It was a pretty bad first impression of Florida. This event requires a bit of backstory. In early 2014, my best friend Lily met a guy named Nathan at a club through one of her friends from her college. She and Nathan instantly hit it off and were officially dating within a few weeks. It only took a few months for Lily to fall head over heels for this guy. Before long, she was even telling me that she thought he was the one. I was happy for her experiencing some good old college romance. It even eventually led to her losing her virginity to this guy. I really had no opinions on this guy, aside from what I heard from Lily. From what I heard at first, he sounded like a nice guy who had a lot of bad stuff happen to him. This guy had some serious baggage. I can't remember if he ever told Lily about his parents or not. He had a 3-year-old son named Isaac, whose mother was a drug addict. Lily was in love with Nathan so much that she was willing to stick with him and help him with some of the drama. In spite of hearing so much about him, I only met him twice. Once when he was picking Lily up from work, we work at the same place. And second, when, I'll get to that. However, things first went downhill when Nathan broke up with Lily in September. He had recently become a rookie police officer and was moving to another city for more training. He said he would come back for her. Still, Lily was devastated by this. But, unexpectedly, he was back in town within a month. This whole episode felt off to me. Lily and Nathan tried to start things up again, and things were starting to look up for the couple. That is, until Christmas rolled around. In something straight out of a soap opera, Lily broke up with Nathan on Christmas, after finding out some damning information about him. After he broke up with Lily in September, he apparently went and slept with one of his cousins and got her pregnant. His cousin later had a miscarriage, and, to add to that, Nathan revealed that he had both chlamydia and genital herpes. He knew he had these, and yet he purposely didn't tell Lily in order to have lots of unprotected sex with her. Lily got herself tested, and while she didn't contract chlamydia, she tested positive for genital herpes. As expected, she was devastated by this and went through a brief period of depression. It quickly became apparent that Nathan was not at all the type of person Lily had first thought him to be. He was a sexist, a womanizer, a cheat, and a liar. He had sex with multiple women, and, just like with Lily, he kept the information about his STDs secret. He even tried to turn all of his friends against Lily, saying that she broke up with him, and even tried to drive apart Lily and Yasmina, the fiancée of one of Nathan's cousins, who was now close friends with Lily. Lily didn't stand for this, and made sure the truth was known. She talked to Yasmina and her fiancé about it, and they eventually kicked Nathan out of their place. Words began spreading in Nathan's community about his wrongdoings, and even his backup girlfriends broke up with him. It wasn't long before Lily was taking self-defense and gun classes. Nathan knew where she lived, and obviously had some weapons training due to being a rookie police officer, a job he soon lost. She often told me how she was somewhat afraid of him, but mostly she was furious. If he had ever tried to hurt her, I'm sure she would have blown his brains out. Anyway, my second and final encounter with Nathan was at the tail end of this drama earlier this year. My first encounter with Nathan had been brief, but afterwards, Lily had told me that Nathan had been initially jealous of me due to the fact that I was a close guy friend of Lily's. We'd been friends since we were toddlers, and that we had, quote-unquote, dated back during freshman year of high school. While our first encounter had been brief and under friendly terms, our second encounter was far from that. I had the morning shift at work that day, and had just ended my shift. It was early in the afternoon, so I was hurrying to my car to get out of the heat. As I walked to my car, I quickly noticed Nathan leaning against his car a few rows away. As you can expect, I was furious upon seeing him, given all the crap he'd caused for my friend. I assumed that he was waiting for Lily or something. I only chuckled because Lily was on a family vacation in Montana at the time. I decided not to confront him. I was always keen on listening to Lily and give my 2 cents, but for the most part, I'd been successful at staying away from this drama. Suddenly, Nathan turned in my direction and immediately stood up completely. He tapped on his car, and who I assumed was a friend of his stepped out. They began to power walk in my direction. Wasting no time, I jumped in my car, started the ignition, and pulled out of my parking spot. As I did, I heard a loud knock on the back of my car. I looked in the rearview mirror to see Nathan punching the back window in some feeble attempt to stop me. I kept going. I was almost out of the parking lot when I looked in my rearview mirror again to see his car speeding in my direction. I sped out of the parking lot with him right on my tail. He continued to follow me for several streets. There was no way I was heading home with him following. I ended up taking the craziest detour of my life, pulling off and on feeders, driving through parking lots, driving circles in neighborhoods. I did it all. Eventually, after about 25 minutes of driving, I lost him. I drove around for a little while afterwards in order to make sure I had officially lost him. When I got home, I called Lily, told her everything. She thought about calling the police, but before we could decide on whether or not to do that, Lily got a call from Yasmina, who had been spying on Nathan for Lily for quite some time. We learned that Nathan had apparently packed up his stuff from where he was living and had taken off. He was gone. To where? I don't know. I heard rumors about him wanting to go to New York City, Mexico, but those are the only possibilities I remember. All that matters is that now he's officially out of Lily's life. I'm not sure what would have happened if he had caught me that day. Lily guessed that Nathan might have been trying to hurt me in order to get back at her. I'm glad that I was a good enough driver to lose him. Otherwise, I don't want to think about what he could have done to me. Nathan, I hope Lily and I never meet you again. So I just got back from a trip to New York City. I go there multiple times a year as I have family and a handful of close friends that live there. I've been meaning to post this since it happened a couple of nights ago, but I wanted to make sure I had the time to sit down and regather all the details correctly. I'm sure we've all heard of crazy subway stories at one point or another, but I never thought I would end up in one this terrifying. So I was heading back to my hotel from a friend's house at about 3 a.m. the other night. A friend lives deep in Brooklyn. My hotel was in Manhattan, so if you know the city, you know that's about a 30 to 45-minute long train ride. My train finally arrived, and I was happy to be headed home. I was exhausted, and it was late. My trip had been going unexpectedly well up to this point, so I had faith I'd be able to get home with no worries, especially since the trains and streets were basically empty at this hour. The train was brand new and had just been cleaned, something I'd never seen before. Hell, it even smelled like new car. and still had fresh mop water on the floor. There was only about 3 other people on my train, all minding their own business. So far, so good. About 2 stops into the train ride, a man that looked like he was in his late 20s stumbled into our train car mid-ride through the connecting doors of the cars. He had on a Nike ski mask, a shiesty mask, if you know you know, which usually isn't a good sign on a nice 70-degree night in general context, but I'm not one to judge by appearance. Plus, I know the shiesty mask is sort of a trend nowadays, so I didn't think too much of it at first. He sort of hobbled in and was clutching his stomach, almost if he was concealing something or hiding a wound. His eyes were bloodshot red, and at first I thought it was because he was high or something. He immediately hobbled into the nearest corner and sort of sulked into the corner, facing it, until the next stop. He then ran out the closest door and erupted into the most painful crying I've ever heard. He was just screaming, moaning, and crying, all while stumble running alongside the stopped train on the platform, still clutching his stomach, screaming things like,
"Why?"
and gasping through his tears. Keep in mind, I'm sitting in the middle of the train facing away from the side he got off, so I'm kind of breaking my neck behind me as he's running behind me to watch what's going on. He then ran back inside the same car, through the door on the opposite side of the car now. He was on my right before, now he's on my left. There's no one in between me and him now, since everyone else was closer to the right side. He did the sulking while facing into the corner thing on the other side of the car now, but this time he kept crying and yelling things like,
"Why?"
again. But he was crying so hysterically that it was hard to make out a lot of what he was saying. From the certain words I gathered, though, I'm almost positive that a very close friend of his had just gotten killed or something. It's the only thing that would explain the way he was acting and the things he was saying. Plus, he was suited up like he had just gone back from a street mission gone bad or something. At this point, everyone on the train was frantically flicking their eyes over to him every few seconds. You could tell they were panicked, but not trying to cause a scene about it or rile him up more. I was getting a little sussed out myself, but I had seen and heard about worse on the subway. And if someone he knew had really just died, then I honestly just felt horrible for the guy before anything else. But then the entire situation escalated to a point that I had only seen in movies or crime shows. The man stayed in his corner, crying, screaming, and muttering things to himself for another 3 minutes or so, all while still clutching his stomach as if he was concealing something. I'd definitely seen a black object in his hands by this point, but I couldn't tell if it was big enough to be a gun or not. After I saw this, I tried not to take my eyes off of him for too long at a time, since I was the closest person to him, but I also didn't want to stare. By this point, he was starting to say some concerning things, like,
"Someone's got to pay for this."
and then he would just repeat it louder and louder. And then he burst into a dialogue that made my heart fucking drop. Keep in mind, he's still facing the corner, hunched over, clutching his item.
"All you motherfuckers sitting on this train right now, y'all gonna feel me tonight. You hear me? Y'all gonna feel me tonight. And y'all gonna fucking hate it too. Oh my god. Y'all are gonna fucking hate this. Y'all gonna hate me."
He kept getting louder and louder as he was saying this, to the point where he was basically screaming by the last part. I don't know what he said after that, because as soon as that train stopped next, it fucking bolted. He was screaming shit at me as I got off, but I couldn't hear it. I definitely wasn't trying to turn back. I ran back up to the nearest street exit, chain-smoked a couple cigarettes, and waited 20 minutes for the next train to come. I've seen enough in my life to know that this wasn't a situation I was willing to gamble with, at all. I pray the last 3 people in that train got home safe, and nothing happened. I briefly searched Twitter and the news the next day for any possible info I could find, and didn't see anything. So, to the man on the subway at 3 a.m., I pray you find the solace you need, and heal from whatever trauma you're going through. But please, let's not ever meet again. This happened in 2014 and 2015. I, female, was 20 years old. I'll give you some context before letting you know what happened. I was studying in a lovely seaside city in France, and everybody was cycling all the time. Cycling to school, to work, to parties, etc. It was a very safe place full of tourists and students. I lived and studied in the city between 2012 and 2015. Up until the events I'm going to mention, I never felt unsafe, and I didn't hear anything from my friends either. In December 2014, my boyfriend took me to his engineering school's Christmas party. We were a large group of friends and mingled a lot. One of the guys from the group, whom I don't know personally, left the party without anyone noticing. A month later, he was found dead in the harbor, and the police never figured out what happened. I went online to check if there was any news, and it's still a cold case. I didn't know him, but I think about it all the time. Was it because he was alone? Did he fall? Or did someone push him? Why didn't anyone care to walk home with him? Needless to say, the city started to feel a whole lot less safe. But at 20 years old, I didn't have the same understanding of such things as I do now as a 30-year-old. My life carried on. A couple of months passed, and it was the beginning of 2015. A friend was assaulted badly while cycling back home after a party. He was found in critical condition, his body laying halfway on the road and halfway on the sidewalk. His head had been smashed on the sidewalk step, and his jaw was completely shattered. He was a big guy in every sense possible, not the sort of guy you'd push around easily. When he was recovering in the hospital, he couldn't make sense of what had happened. He had no idea why he was attacked on his bike. The police didn't find the suspects. 2 students my age in the same friend circles were brutally assaulted for no reason. I still cycled everywhere because I had no other choice. I lived 8 kilometers away from my school and didn't have any other means of transportation. This meant that I cycled approximately 16 to 20 kilometers every day, and I had been doing it since 2012. We are in the spring of 2015. I'm cycling back home from a party with my boyfriend. I've had a few drinks, but I am not drunk. I'm just tired. My boyfriend is annoying me because he's not waiting for me, and the distance between us keeps getting bigger. Suddenly, someone jumps on me. He appears from nowhere and kicks my bike to the floor. I've been cycling so much, I'm so used to the bike. I let it fall between my legs, but I do not fall. I resist and stand up. It's a man. I reach for my bike, which is now on the floor, with my left hand. I'm trying to get a hold of the handlebars. He kicks me, then my hand. He kicks again and again, but I'm already holding the handlebars. It hurts, but I'm lifting the bike. He says something, and I don't hear it. I see my boyfriend looking at me. He's a bit far away, but he stops cycling. He's going to help me. The man will see that I'm not alone. I'm still standing and lifting my bike. It's been maybe 2 or 3 seconds since the man jumped on me. My boyfriend is looking at me, and then he turns his back. My heart drops. He starts pedaling away. It's the dead of night, and there's no one else. I'm on my own. The man keeps kicking. He wants me to let go. My hand looks blue, but my grip is strong. I think about the other 2 students. They give me strength. I think about my boyfriend. The sight of him cycling away fills me with pure rage. I'll use this rage. The man is holding some kind of glass in his hand. I grab it with my free hand, and I smash it into his face. I'm doing it. I'm furious. I'm getting the bike up. Surely the glass had alcohol in it, because it burns his eyes. I have a split second to launch myself, and I start pedaling away. He can't reach my hand anymore, so he kicks my bike one more time. I stand strong on the pedals. He tries to chase me, but I am faster. I pedal until I can no longer breathe. I pedal until I feel numb. That night, I know I escaped something terrible. Due to the stress, I couldn't describe the man. I'll never know for sure if my experience was linked to the other attacks. However, we were all walking and cycling on the same route. 10 years later, I can still remember the look on my ex-boyfriend's face when he turned his back on me. Let's never meet, either of these two men, again. About 13 years ago, when I was 22, I was driving home after having dinner with my folks. I lived alone at the time in a townhouse unit located in a low-income area notorious for crime. It was late at night, around 10:30 p.m., Saturday night. Somewhere during the half-hour drive home, I noticed a white utility following the same route I was taking. I didn't think much of it at the time, as there was a reasonable amount of traffic around, and the roads I took home were single-laned. At my unit, there was limited angled parking out in the front, and although it wasn't reserved for tenants, the spots were almost always filled with my neighbors' cars. It was a dark, residential area. I pulled in between two cars. Then I noticed the white utility pull into the last available spot. I thought it was strange, as I didn't recognize the car as being one of my neighbors. I had a bad feeling, so I busied myself, pretending to organize my things to take inside my house. Maybe he was lost and checking his map? Who knows? After a few minutes, I decided to leave the car. Then he started whistling to get my attention, like how you'd whistle to a dog. I was standing by my car, keys in my hand to open the front door, which was only 10 meters from where I stood. "Can I help you?" I asked, totally feeling the bad vibes now. Although it was dark, I could make out a man of about 30, maybe Greek or Italian, heavy-set, with long hair, and tight, greasy ringlets.
"What are you doing tonight?"
he inquired, throwing his cigarette butt out the window. Thinking quickly, I said I was visiting my boyfriend and headed to my door. By the time I had locked and peered out the upstairs window, he was gone. 2 months later, I was leafing through the local newspaper when I recognized the face sketch on the police report page. It's that friggin' guy. He'd whistled at a woman in the supermarket car park just down the road, like I had experienced. But she had approached his car, and bam, he tried to pull her in. Luckily, she broke free and reported it to the police. The article asked for anyone with information to call the local detective, so obviously I immediately got on the phone. The detective was unavailable, and I never got a call back. I still wonder if they found that guy. This happened 2 summers ago while I was house sitting out in California for an older couple I had met at a conference for work. It had seemed like a dream scenario. The couple wanted to vacation in Hawaii for 2 weeks, but didn't want to board their cats. And I had been chatting with them about wanting to visit California again, because I had loved it the first time I went, and we figured that it could mutually benefit if I came out and house sat for them. So I flew out there, and they showed me around for a few days. Taught me how to care for the cats, 2 of them, one that was extremely shy and I barely saw, which is important later, and their plants, and gave me access to their house and cars. These people were so generous. Before I knew it, I had dropped them off at the airport and was on my own. At first, it really was the dream vacation. I was staying in Oakland and making forays into San Fran, Sonoma, Monterey. In the mornings, I could walk out the front door and shortly be hiking the paths surrounding nearby Mount Diablo, and I was just ultra content with the world. I was so enamored by the area that I'd actually started looking into taking some steps to relocate out there even. But then one day, about halfway through my final week there, when I had gotten back to the house, I felt really odd, almost like I shouldn't go inside. I shook it off and went inside anyway, because it was getting late and I needed to put out dinner for the cats. Once I was inside, I forced myself to ignore how off I felt. I made some food for myself, went to bed, and was shocked to find the shy cat hiding under my bed and crying. This was the first time I'd even seen her close up. The entire time I had been there up to that point, she had never really left my host's bedroom unless she didn't realize I was around. Again, I ignored feeling weird and just assumed that she had decided I was okay and went to bed. I did start locking my bedroom door that night, though. I also remember that about halfway through that night, I thought I heard someone walking around in the gravel outside of my window, but after listening for a bit, I didn't hear anything else and went back to bed. The day after, in the morning, I still felt a little odd, but kept up with my plans for the day. I drove out to a little music festival in Sonoma and went clothes shopping and had an overall great day. When I got back to the house, though, I found the front door locked in a way I hadn't left it. Basically, my hosts never lock the deadbolt, only the lower, second lock, and that's the only lock my key worked on, so I never messed with the deadbolt, but it was definitely locked. So I had to call my hosts and find the hideaway key, which, to their credit, safety-wise, was buried like a whole foot underneath a bush outside, and had definitely not been unearthed for a long time. So I used that, went inside, and kept the key with me just in case it happened again. And it did, but with a different door. This time I had stepped out into the garage to get a drink, and when I turned around to go back into the house, the door was shut and locked. I could use my normal key on that door, but I was still pretty bewildered. My own cats are whack, so I think my mind was just trying to come up with a way that cats could be locking me out of the house, but I was coming up empty. I decided I must have been misunderstanding how the locks worked, and just wrote it off and started checking and triple-checking locks when I went out of the house, or into the garage. That night, when I went to bed, the really awful feeling of unease was still there, and so was the shy cat, who was clearly unhappy to see me, but also wouldn't leave my room. But again, I just locked my bedroom door and went to sleep. The next morning, I felt awful. Nausea, body ache. I had no desire to leave the house, so I decided to stay in and Netflix for a day. This vacation stay was like a full 2 weeks, so I didn't feel like I was in a hurry to get all my touristy things in. But as the day went on, I started to feel that feeling of wrongness again, and it morphed into feeling incredibly watched. Around mid-afternoon, it got to the point that I was so uneasy that, even feeling awful, I decided to get out of the house for a bit to shake it off. I was getting a bit low on food, so I went to the grocery store and bought a couple of food items that I didn't think would hurt my stomach. And as I started to leave the checkout, the cashier said the generic, "Have a great evening." And I just instantly started crying, shocking myself and the poor cashier, because I just had this intrusive thought that said, "You might be the last person to ever say that to me." When I got to my car, I was still crying, and my entire body was telling me not to drive back to the house. I couldn't not, though, because I didn't want to neglect the cats. So I drove back, parked in the driveway, and convinced myself after about a half hour just to open the front door. Once I did that, I thought I would get over it and be able to go in and at least feed the cats, and then maybe I'd go get a hotel room after. But my body physically would not let me inside. It was like I was stuck in the entryway. I then made a deal with myself. I would yell into the house, saying I'd already called the police and that they were on their way. In panic logic, I figured that it would make anyone in the house leave. So, I faced the inside of the house, looking down the hallway towards the bedrooms, and I did just that. The second I had finished saying, "They're almost here, so if you want to avoid being arrested, you need to leave now," the light in my host's room turned on, and I heard some banging. I immediately hightailed it back to the car, called the police for real, and proceeded to have a mental breakdown while talking to the dispatcher. Once they got there, they checked the house and didn't find anyone. But the double doors in my host's bedroom were left wide open. I'm so glad the cats didn't get out. And there was a pile of food wrappers in the corner behind the blinds. So they said it looked like someone had been there. What makes it so scary to me is that nothing was taken, and that based on the shape of the house, that would have been the perfect vantage point to see me in the living room as I stayed home sick. To explain this, the house was an L shape, and from the windows into the garden that were in my host's bedroom, you could see the living room windows. Also, the minute the police were gone, they said they couldn't prove anyone was there, as there were no signs of forced entry, and we couldn't get a hold of my hosts immediately to verify if anything had been taken, so they said that they'd patrol a bit, but nothing else. The shy cat was right back in my host's bedroom, and I didn't see her again until I left to go back home. So basically, I think the intruder had been there at least 2 days, forcing her to choose between two strangers, and leading her to choose the one that was a little less strange, me. It messed me up pretty bad, especially because they didn't catch the person and didn't seem to have any desire to look, and I still had to stay in that house for the next 3 days. Nothing else odd happened, and I didn't feel anything off the rest of the time I was there, but the damage was done. I'd never felt completely safe in a home without doing a complete search before bed since, but I'm extremely glad my gut spoke up. I guess I'd rather have some residual anxiety than be dead. So whoever was in my host's house watching me, let's please never meet. I just graduated from college and was still living outside the major city my school was near. There's public transit that's relatively reliable, so sometimes I would go into the city for special occasions, knowing I could get back safely. For Halloween that year, my boyfriend and I decided to take the train and actually go to an event, not just a house party. This is only important because of how it influenced my outfit. As a female, there are a lot of footwear rules, and I was worried that if I didn't wear heels, I might not be allowed into the club we were going to. I debated for, well, way too long, and I switched between heels and flats a couple of times. I was wearing a black dress that I turned into a black widow spider costume by putting a red cutout in the front, and in the end, I ended up wearing black Chucks, sneakers. The night was great and relatively uneventful, and I didn't get hassled about my flats. At some point, I decided I was exhausted and wanted to head home, but boyfriend was going on strong and didn't really want to leave, which was no problem since we took public transportation. Insert foreshadowy eye roll. He gave me the key to his house, which was about a mile from the train station, and we planned that I would head back, and he would join me later. The mile I had to cover went by a mall, a school, finally a church that abruptly ended and turned into a row of houses that boyfriend lived in. There was a designated sidewalk the whole way, but it also ran along a 4-lane road. I knew that there was a potential for late-night vagabonds, but I figured that they most likely would be around a station or a mall. So by the time I was at the church and could see my destination, which was the second house on the row, I was considering myself safe. As I passed the church on the right sidewalk, I'm about 200 yards from the house, and I hear a vehicle start to slow down as it approaches on my left. The speed limit for this area was 35 miles per hour, but people often fly down it, and I'd say on average, people go about 45, given there were 2 lanes each way. The van had probably been going about 45 because the sound of it slowing down was noticeable. I say van because the sound of the de-escalation caused me to turn and see a white, hard-sided, really dark-tinted, front-windowed van pulling over. Luckily, it was going so fast, it wasn't able to stop until it had pulled past me about 20 yards, where it just sat idling next to the sidewalk. I stopped walking because there was no reason for the van to stop there, and I didn't want to walk by the sliding door. After about 30 seconds of the van idling and no one getting out, I decided to quickly scuttle up the church flower beds so I wouldn't be close enough to be grabbed by anyone who might open the sliding door. At first, nothing happened, and I felt dumb for being paranoid. And that's when I sent 1,000 prayers for deciding to wear flats that day. After about 10 seconds of letting me walk on, so I still had about 150 yards to go, I heard the van gun its engine and watched as it zoomed by and then screeched to a stop in front of me about 10 feet away, cutting into the sidewalk with the tail sticking into the road. Hearing the driver's door open sent a jolt of adrenaline I had never felt before or since, and I took off sprinting in my glorious flats. As I passed the front of the van, I saw the driver passing the side mirror, meaning he was already outside the door attempting to make his way to the front. This is basically the end of my story because I, up on my tiptoes, sprinted all the way to the house and cut through some trees to lose him. I wasn't pursued any further, as far as I could tell, and was able to get inside and lock the door. I will always be grateful I ended up wearing flats that night so I could run for my life. I don't really like considering what might have happened if I had been in heels. Man in the van. Let's never meet. This just happened tonight. My mom and I are currently placing heavier curtains to cover my windows. Basically, I sleep in a room that has a window to the side, which faces an alley. I don't know another word for it, but it's a really narrow piece of street in our subdivision. What separates my window and the alley is a fence and a bit of what we call our yard, just wider for a person to walk through, and some potted plants on the fence. I was lounging in my bed, browsing Reddit on the phone, when our neighbor shouted really loud by the window, and my mom went outside. Our neighbor told us that there was this guy peeping through the glass windows in my room. He was topless and was fiddling with his shorts. Turns out the glass windows we had weren't one way. We never noticed because there used to be a street light by this alley, and when you walked past it, you would just see your reflection on my window. It has been a couple of weeks since the street light burned out, and the curtain I had on wasn't enough to protect privacy. My mom reported it immediately while our neighbor stood guard. When my mom returned, we placed heavier curtains in the windows. I know there's a lot of things going on here. We should have double-checked the windows. We should have placed heavier curtains in the first place, etc. But the fact of the matter is, no one should ever feel unsafe in their own home. I don't even want to think about how many nights the guy kept coming back to peep at me. Peeping Tom at the window. Let's not meet. This happened in 2005 during Christmas vacation. I moved away for college and came back home to visit for the holidays. Spent a week in my hometown in a snowy state. On my last night there, my friend and I decided to go sledding at 3 a.m. We get in her car and both go down a few times. We're both at the top of the hill. She gets ready to go again, but I stop her. She asks what's wrong, and I tell her that I had a bad feeling. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I felt nervous. I told her we need to leave now. We drive back to my family home. We lived in a town where no one locked their doors. The crime was almost nothing, and all the neighbors knew each other. When we got back, something told me to lock all the doors. Then I checked the windows, and several were unlocked. My flight was only 4 hours away to go back to campus. I slept for maybe 2. I wanted to see the snow and smell the fresh air, so I stepped outside. I looked at a huge pine tree we had at the front side of our yard. I always thought the way the snow laid on the branches looked so beautiful. And then something caught my eye. What should have been pure fresh snow was littered in huge man-sized footprints. They wrapped around the tree and went towards the backyard. I was thinking maybe my uncle had been out there smoking or something, just thinking of any way to rationalize why those prints were there. The same feeling came back to me when we were sledding, the anxious and paranoid feeling in the pit of my stomach. I look to my left, and I see a man. He is running. He is sprinting, staring straight at me. He was probably close to 300 pounds and maybe 6 feet, and for his size, he was super fast. I froze in fear with the realization he's not just doing a morning jog, and he is coming to me. I tried to move several times, but I was almost too scared. With everything in me, I opened my front door, slammed it shut, and locked it. I run to the window and look onto my porch and see the man standing there. He had his hand on my door. He turns his head, and I follow his gaze to a man in a white van. The guy in the van throws up his hands in a gesture to say, "Well?" The runner just threw his hands up and shook his head. The runner walks back to the van, gets in, and they drive away. My heart's still pounding. I wake up my friend and make her walk around the house with me. There, we find the footprints went to every door and window around my house. She too tried to rationalize it, but to me, I know if he had reached me, I wouldn't be writing this post. The malicious look on his face as he ran to me told me everything. Christmas Eve at Burger King. Sounds innocent enough, right? Not my first choice, but I had to work late, and being Christmas Eve, it looked to be my best choice. I got finished working at 9 and had some coupons for Burger King, so that made my decision for me. When I got to Burger King, I noticed it was open, but the dining room was shut down. The only way I could get something is if I went through the drive-thru. Only problem is, I don't have a car. I tried to walk up to the drive-thru and place my order, but the compassionate young lady working the drive-thru wasn't having it. She told me if I didn't have a vehicle, I could not use the drive-thru. I became rather aggravated and began saying things that I'm not proud of. At this moment, an older woman wearing shining armor appeared on the scene and offered me to jump in her car and order my food. At first, I turned her down, not wanting to be a bother, but after some convincing, I decided to accept her help. After ordering my food, it took so long to get it that I missed my bus and got upset. The nice woman offered me a ride home, and I felt kind of off-put by the offer and declined. She was persistent, but at the same time nice, and convinced me to take her offer. Mind you, I'm a 250-pound 30-something man, so I really didn't feel that threatened by a 50-something woman. If the circumstances were different, I would have not have taken the ride. After I told her where I lived, we proceeded home. About 5 minutes from my home, she made a wrong turn. I explained that I lived the other way, and that we needed to turn around, or let me out here, and I'll walk the rest of the way. It was then that the woman's demeanor changed, and she told me that she could not let me spend Christmas Eve alone, and that she was taking me to her house. I told her that I needed to get home immediately to let my dog out, and that I would be fine. The woman then tried to entice me with cocaine and liquor at her place, but since I'm in recovery, I told her I wasn't interested. She refused to turn around or let me out, and started to drive strangely, not stopping at stop signs. I'm not gonna lie, my mind was racing, and I began to sweat. I knew that I could physically overpower this woman, but what awaited me at her house? I also felt bad about hurting her after all of her kindness, but I had to get away before her house, and I didn't know where it was, so I didn't know how much time I had. Then, all of a sudden, luckily, the car in front was stopped at a stop sign, and across from it, another was stopped also. She had to slow down to almost a stop at this point, and this is where I made my break. I jumped out with the car still moving, leaving my food, and I took off running. As I was running away, she stopped and got out of her car and began trying to talk me into getting back into the car with her. That just wasn't an option. I don't know what her motives were or who she was, but I knew I wasn't willing to risk my life over it. I ran all the way home and made sure I wasn't followed. What would have happened to me if it was 2 years earlier and I was still doing drugs and drinking? Her offer of cocaine and booze would have probably worked. Being a man, the thought of the vulnerability most women face every day was so foreign to me, and now I understand the fear on most women's face. I really felt this nice woman had nefarious purposes, and that I just so happened to be the perfect victim of opportunity. Any thoughts would be appreciated. I never went to the cops because it felt like they might not believe me, or they might look down on me for being scared. Should I place a police report? What if by me not reporting this, someone else ends up getting hurt? Or am I just jumping the gun? And conclusions. Several years ago, a friend and I went on a multi-day hiking trip during winter. While preparing for the trip, I found a forum dedicated to the trail we'd be hiking, and several threads about people going missing on it. Most of the members blamed the hikers themselves, saying that they were most likely inexperienced would-be adventurers who had went off the trail and gotten lost. There was one old man on the forum who claimed he completed the trail once a year for the past 50 or so years, and he believed there was something more sinister behind these disappearances. Naturally, the other members laughed at him. We set off before sunrise to get as many miles in as possible on the first day. That entire day, we only met one other person, a friendly middle-aged man who lived somewhat locally. He seemed impressed that we were taking on the trail in winter, and even invited us to camp near his property, but we declined and pressed on. That night, we were surprised by some pretty dangerous terrain around the edge of the lake and took the decision to sleep in our bivy sacks under an overhanging rock. Not exactly ideal camping conditions, but given the potential hazards, we felt that this was the smartest choice. I don't sleep well at the best of times in a bivy sack, and if you've ever been zipped into one, you'll know how claustrophobic it can feel. The rock hanging over my head didn't help either. A few hours after I did eventually manage to fall asleep, I woke suddenly to the sound of my friend shouting and swearing at me. I popped my head out of my bivvy and saw that he was still zipped inside his, had somewhat gotten off the relatively level ground we'd been sleeping on, and was slowly sliding down towards the lake. I quickly got up and dragged him, with great effort, back up to the level ground. He was absolutely furious with me, claiming that he'd felt me drag him, but soon calmed down and accepted that he'd most likely rolled over repeatedly in his sleep. We didn't go back to sleep, instead had some coffee and breakfast while waiting for the sun to come up. When we did set off, it started to rain heavily and didn't stop for most of the day. I was also having some troubles with an old injury in my leg, which slowed us down considerably. The sun seemed to disappear rather suddenly near the top of a deceptively steep hill, so we set up camp there and then, this time in a tent. After the rough couple of days that we had, we were grateful to be inside a tent, and the ground underneath us was actually not too bad. We talked and joked about the trip so far, and for some reason, I remember my friend expressing his disappointment that he'd forgotten to pack his iPad, and then we tried to sleep. Soon after, I began to hear what sounded like human footsteps. I thought to myself, surely there isn't someone else out here climbing this hill at night. The sound continued, and the more intently I listened, the more I became certain of what I was hearing. I poked my head out of the tent, and the sound stopped. I got out to pee and look around. Not a soul in sight. Shortly after getting back into my sleeping bag, the footsteps started again, and this time they started circling our tent. By this point, I was pretty frightened, and I asked my friend, "Are you hearing this?" He responded, "Yes, I fucking am." Knowing that he'd been hearing them the entire time, and sounded as freaked out as I did, genuinely terrified me. We got out of the tent again and asked if anyone was there, but again, there was no one around, and the sound had stopped instantly. The footsteps around the tent continued for quite some time. We didn't sleep. As soon as the sun came up, we packed up our things, got off the trail, and hiked to the nearest village, got a cab to the nearest town, and made our way home. We've never been able to find a convincing explanation of what could have been causing the sound of the footsteps that night, and my friend has since become a full-fledged missing person, paranormal, and conspiracy enthusiast. When I was 8 years old, back in the mid-1970s, I was in the Scouts. Me, my sister, and my parents lived in a house in quite a safe suburban neighborhood, just south of Stockholm, Sweden. It was only a 20-minute walk from my house to the Scouts group facilities, so I usually walked there or rode my bike. The evening this incident took place, I had walked. An hour and a half later, at 8:30 p.m., I was on my way home. It was mid-October and dark outside at that time of year. I had to pass a large parking lot and a closed gas station, both poorly lit, an area I always found eerie. I hurried past it every time until I came to a junction, and this evening was no different. When I crossed the street, I was finally in my own neighborhood, where I knew every tree, bush, stone, nook, and cranny, as kids do. I was walking on the sidewalk along a road leading up to a roundabout. Cars were passing by as usual, even though it wasn't much traffic at that hour, and that's when it happened. As I took another normal step forwards, it was like the entire world suddenly slowed down and came to a complete stop in just a second. There was a sound that I much later came to associate to the deep subwoofer THX test sound at the cinema before the movie started, if you know what I mean. I experienced tunnel vision, and it was completely silent. No cars, no people, no movement, no nothing. The entire situation couldn't have lasted more than 15 or 20 seconds tops. and then it was over, just as sudden as it had begun. My left foot, that had been frozen in midair for the entire time, hit the ground. It was quite frightening, yet extremely fascinating. First, I was just standing there, stunned, and then, very cautiously, I took a step forward, but nothing except my sneakers got wet by stepping into a puddle of water. I suddenly realized that the rain was drizzling down, and my clothes and hair were absolutely soaking wet. Only a few seconds before, it had been a clear and calm night sky with visible stars. I did find the entire situation quite bizarre and hurried home. I couldn't wait to tell my parents what happened, but as soon as I opened the door, I was met with both my parents in a sheer state of panic. They both asked in an angry tone where I had been. I became perplexed and defensive, so I stuttered that I had been to the Scouts, and then I went straight home. My mother pointed at the clock on the wall and told me to stop lying. The clock said 21:55. More than 1 hour had passed since I left the Scouts. I insisted over and over again that I had walked straight home, and my mother got even more angry. She was, of course, extremely worried, but it came out as anger. But since I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet was unjustly accused of lying, I got really angry too. I think it caught my parents completely off guard, because it was not the reaction they had expected at all. That's when my father turned to my mother and said, "I think she's telling the truth." I'll never forget that, because I was so relieved. My mom looked completely bewildered, but stopped yelling and asked again, "But where have you been?" However, this time, she was hugging me harder than she'd ever had before. When they realized I wasn't hurt or traumatized, and behaved just as usual, my father told me he'd walked the exact same route I took between the house and the Scout facilities 3 times, repeatedly calling my name, and I simply wasn't there. They had called the parents of all my friends, and were in the process of calling the police when I stepped through the door. I simply couldn't believe it. They asked me, more calmly this time, if something had happened along the way, anything at all. I was just about to say that nothing had happened when I remembered the strange incident that I had completely forgotten about due to all the commotion, so I told them exactly what I had described here above. They looked at me in mixed disbelief and fascination, but as far as I can remember, they didn't push it any farther. Fact is, the whole situation wasn't discussed until years later, when me and my father talked about it again. I again insisted that things happened exactly like I had told him years ago, and he replied that he wanted to believe me, but the story was simply too fantastic to take in, even after all these years had passed. He said, "You were gone, son, as if you had simply vanished from the face of the earth. You were missing for more than an hour. Where did that time go? Where did you go?" Needless to say, I couldn't answer him. Even later, when my father had died, I talked to my mother about it, and to my surprise, she laughed and said she always thought I'd been abducted by aliens. I'm 55 now, and I still can't make heads or tails of that incident. I never saw any strange lights or disc-shaped objects, but believe me, I really wish I had. That would at least have made some kind of sense. However, I truly haven't gotten a clue what happened in that lost hour. All I know is that it happened exactly the way I told you now. I told my wife about it, but I never told anyone else. However, I did write the entire thing down the same night it happened, and so did my mom, I much later found out. So what do you think? Any thoughts? If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I wasn't sure where to post this, but I needed the validation that I'm not insane. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this. I'm in college, and me and 7 other people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Saleski State Forest, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I've always been able to sense energies of places, and the energy of this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual one-person tents, and we formed kind of a cluster in this site, with my tent being in the back, so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared-off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had sort of a heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it just sounded like 2 legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping, and then would move on to walk around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear human-like breathing when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed like I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shaped from my tent, although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent, because it was all zipped up. It was like a warm glow. I might have assumed it was someone's flashlight, except no one was moving. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point, I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted that she heard footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre, and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said he also noticed the light that came on, but thought it was someone else. Not a single person in this group went up to go to the bathroom or turn on a light that night. I've heard things about the Appalachians regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. Has anyone had a similar experience? A little while back, I decided I needed to get back out there and start trying to meet people. Not necessarily actively looking for a relationship, but meeting people at bars just wasn't working for me. So, as most single college girls, I downloaded a dating app. I met a lot of people and talked to them online, and it gave me the confidence to try to actually go out on a date every now and then. I didn't meet up with many of these guys in person, but there were a few. Most didn't lead to a second date, but there was one that was worse than the rest. I met this guy, Alex, and we made plans to go out to dinner. He said he wanted to take me to this nice restaurant in the town between us, but when the day came, he never answered his phone. The next day, he contacts me with a story about getting stuck at work and forgetting his phone at home. Whatever, excuses. I wasn't really buying it, but he asked to reschedule. Stupidly enough, I said yes. So the day comes, and he tells me to meet him at his house, and he will drive us to the restaurant he made the reservations at. He said to come hungry like 3 times, and kept reminding me not to eat beforehand. I guess this place has big plates. Now, I don't really like meeting people for the first time at their home, or getting into their car, but we'd been talking for over a week, so I figured, what the hell? But when I got close, he calls and tells me to park in the parking lot down the road. Weird, but okay. Small driveway, I guess. Trouble is, I never told him what kind of car I drove, but he pulled up to the parking lot right behind me and texted me that he was parked 2 spots down. Red flag, number 1. So I get in his car against my better judgment, and we start heading for the restaurant. Now, I didn't really know where we were exactly. I'm not really familiar with the town, but I knew the restaurant we were heading to, and it shouldn't have been more than like 10 minutes away on a major highway. But almost 25 minutes later, we're driving down some dark back road. So I look at him and said, "Hey, where the hell are we going anyway?" He proceeded to tell me that he hadn't told me the full story. Apparently, when he called to make reservations, it took 3 times of calling before they actually answered. And when somebody finally did answer, they told him that they had moved locations and gave him a description of where they were now located, like the intersection. My stomach dropped when I realized we had passed that intersection probably 5 minutes before this point, and I realized that he didn't even have the address punched into his GPS, even though GPS was running. Red flag, number 2. So I pulled up my GPS, punched in the name of the restaurant, and it said the business was closed for the day. Red flag number 3. At this point, yes, I know I was being stupid, but I stayed. We hung out, talked, and got to know each other. Still, the way he went about things was kind of creepy. When he couldn't find the restaurant, he just kind of said, "Don't worry, I know a place we can go," and drove further into the darkness, eventually pulling over to a trail in the woods, and told me we had to walk the rest of the way. He said we were going stargazing. The spot was beautiful and all, but the whole way through the woods to the clearing, he just kept cracking jokes about how he swore he wasn't a serial killer or something, and telling me to promise I wasn't going to steal his keys and take the car and leave him there. Red flag number 4. I'm not sure how to explain this, but through half the night, he just kept lying to me. He would tell me these big, elaborate, detailed stories, and then suddenly end with, "Just kidding, that never happened." It was funny the first time when he tried to convince me he got so drunk one night in college that he got his penis pierced. But after 2 hours of this shit, I realized he had been just kidding about almost everything he had said. I realized I didn't even really know any true thing about this guy. Red flag number 5. Yes, I know I'm an idiot. We were talking about going to watch a movie at his house. He was all for it, and then apparently changed his mind and pulled the car over in front of a park suddenly on the way back. He said he'd rather stay here. He kept trying to dare me to run naked through the park and asked me weirdly sexual and personal questions, like about specific experiences, not even general thoughts or preferences. Suddenly, he demanded to know if I was going to kiss him or not before the night was over, and said he wanted to put on chapstick first. The guy literally made me dig through my purse looking for chapstick while he sat in the driver's seat, making a big show of licking his lips and trying to subtly rub his dick through his pants. But I saw. I told him I didn't have any chapstick, so he said that was fine, but "Why don't you crawl over here and show me what you got?" Cue patting his lap. I told him I didn't think I was comfortable with that, and then he proceeded to reach around me and tried to drag me into his lap, using my butt as leverage. I told him again that I had no intention of sleeping with him or anyone on a first date, and he again said that was fine, but how about a little 2-minute preview? Cue dragging my hand into his lap. Final red flag. Sirens are going off in my head. I got mad at this point. This was after he had spent days telling me how much he hates men who try to force themselves upon women, and how he doesn't understand how anyone could do that, let alone get pleasure from it. This after he said he didn't want to sit too close to me while we were stargazing so he didn't make me uncomfortable. It was like a switch had flipped. I told him that trying to force me wasn't going to make me any more likely to agree, and that I thought he was supposed to be a gentleman, like he'd been telling me all night he was. He told me that he thought I was just scared of how big it was, and that if I didn't want to suck it, there were other options. Again, tries to grab my hand. I told him again that it wasn't going to happen, and he pouted about it. I was racking my brain to think of an excuse to get him to drive me back to my car, when he pulled out his phone, opened a text message thread. He wasn't hiding it. I could see that the last 3 messages were ones sent by him, and he looks at me and says that he got a text from his uncle saying that something had happened at the house and he needed to get home ASAP. I'm done at this point, regardless, but I hate being lied to. If you weren't having a good time, you could have just asked to call it a night. Why lie? Why make up false intentions and then deliberately act the exact opposite way of what you said? Just why? To make things worse, he dropped me off at my car in a dark parking lot at midnight and then just drove off before I had even walked to my car. Obviously, there wasn't going to be a second date, but the kicker, I drove by the old location of the restaurant a few days ago. It never moved. It's still open and right on the highway, and his house is about 2 minutes down the road. Where the hell was he taking me? So creepy Alex from Bumble. Let's not meet again. You suck. To give it some context, I was not wearing a very daring or revealing outfit. I had on a high-waisted skirt and a crop top, but there was maybe 1 to 2 inches of my skin showing maximum. It really was a normal outfit. I was waiting at the train station. The train was late as usual. Next to me on the bench, I see an old man reading a book that's handwritten in Russian. I actually thought it was kind of cute. Didn't think much of it after that. We finally board the train, and the old man ends up sitting across from me. There was no one else in our little booth of 4 benches. The first 30 minutes or so go by without incident. He's reading his handwritten book, and I'm also reading a book and just playing on my phone. As we traveled, the weather starts to get a bit rainy. After a while, the old man looks up and out the window. He looks at me and starts screaming and pointing out the window. At this point, I notice he seems to be missing part of his face around his eye, but I figured he was old, so you don't stay in perfect shape. I'm trying to understand what is happening. He's mostly screaming and not making much sense. I finally understand that he thinks I'm the one who brought on the bad weather. I'm just sitting there, shocked, looking at other passengers for help, and everyone's ignoring me. I turn to look at the man, and he is screaming that it is because of my shirt. I must have the devil inside of me, because no sane person would wear a crop top, obviously. I don't even say anything at this point. He stops screaming and turns a few pages in his book. He pulls out 2 crosses from his pocket, 1 in each hand, holds them towards me, and starts performing an exorcism. Parts in what I assume was Latin, parts in Russian and German. He's leaning towards me, crosses in hand, opening and closing his eyes, screaming throughout the exorcism. I don't even know what to do at this point. I couldn't leave the train cart we were in. Even if I got up, he would still see me, or find me since it was pretty small. I debated going to hide in the bathroom, but I still had a good 50 minutes left in the train, and I was afraid he would wait outside of the door and hurt me as I eventually tried to leave the bathroom. So I sit there. He finishes his exorcism, seems to be content with it. He keeps telling me that I need to leave the country because the churches in Germany are shit, and I needed to go to a good church in Russia for a proper blessing. I nod and sit there. He reads his book. After another 10 minutes or so, he pulls out a card and hands it to me. I look at it, and it says his name and photo, and says that the holder of this card is severely mentally disabled. I'm thinking, maybe he escaped from a facility somewhere? I couldn't get a good look at the name of the hospital. I just anxiously waited for the train ride to end. He says he wants to follow me and make sure that I can keep the devil out. I say no, that's not necessary. He says that he will find me, that Frankfurt isn't a big city, that he can still sense the devil in me, so he's afraid his exorcism didn't work properly. The train is pulling up to the station. He says that I should wait for him, and I say no, to which he says that doesn't matter, because he's drawn to the evil inside of me. I get up, and as soon as the doors open, I run. I ran, and ran, and ran. At this point, I don't even know what my destination is. I just know that it needs to be as far away as possible. Eventually, I go into a big shopping mall and call the friend I was meeting who comes to join me. I never saw that man again. So this happened at the beginning of summer 2017 at 3 a.m. One night, I went drinking at a friend's house. Long story short, 3 people in a small bed was nothing short of annoying, so I told them that I would just walk home instead of staying over, as it wasn't that far away anyway. I left my car there with the intention of picking up the following day. It settled with putting regular clothes over my PJs for the trip, because I was lazy, drunk, and it was chilly out at that time of night. Ready, I left the house and started walking. On the very first street, I crossed a man walking in the opposite direction. Wanting to see if he had gone on his way, I looked back and saw him standing there on the other side of the street, looking straight at me. I got chills down my spine and tried not to let my imagination run wild as I continued on. Suddenly, I heard steps behind me. I glanced back and saw that the man was a few feet behind me, now walking in the same direction and on my side of the street. I began to freak out, but I was reaching a big street with a lot of lights and thought I would soon be in the clear. Every time I looked back, I couldn't see his face, as they were obscured by a baseball cap and a hood. I was yearning for him to show me his face, smile, and say, "I'm not following you. We're just on the same path." That didn't happen. Still panicking, I decided to cross the street to gain some distance between us. Because of this, I ultimately had to cross the street again, and then pass in front of him to get to my street. I decided to enter 911 onto my phone without actually making the call, just in case. I was trying to convince myself that he wasn't stalking me. If he were still following me when I got to my street, I'd go through with the call. So I crossed the street again, passing in front of him at a distance, and got to my street. I used the opportunity of the cover of the buildings to jog ahead, but stopped short, not wanting him to see me hurrying away. If he started chasing at a run, I would come out the loser. Again, steps sounded behind me. It was him. I went through with the 911 call, just to talk to someone and maybe gain some sense of security until I got home. The agent on the phone asked me if I wanted the police to assist. I said no, that maybe this was all paranoia, and that I just needed to talk to someone until I got home. He asked me if I was on 8th Avenue, and I answered that yes, I was. Damn, that felt good. My cell location had given him the clue. So then, the agent asked me to describe the man that was following me. Dark blue jeans, black shoes, a gray hoodie zipped all the way up, and a black baseball cap that hid his face. Arriving at my apartment building, I dashed inside and secured the lock. I thanked the agent on the phone, telling him that I was home and safe, and heading down towards my apartment. Looking back to the front door one more time to see if everything was okay, I saw the man peering in, likely watching to see which apartment I was about to enter. I freaked out. I asked the 911 agent to send police now. When the stalker saw me looking at him, he pulled away, crossing the street to sit on a bench in front of my building. I was so afraid to go into my apartment, not wanting him to know where I lived, especially since I was in a basement and my windows were street level. But I couldn't just stand in the hallway until morning, so I went into my apartment, not turning on any lights, and discreetly closed all my curtains. I was shaking. Looking out, I saw the police spot the man and then began talking to him. Searching him, they escorted him to their car and took him away. I went to my bed in shock. After a while, I nudged the curtains open again. All I could see was the empty bench the man had been sitting on. I didn't really sleep that night. The thought of everything that could have happened to me if I hadn't contacted the police and had instead just faked talking to someone like most people do. I'm from Canada, and here the police can't arrest someone unless they have been in possession of a weapon or was in the process of breaking his parole. So yeah, mysterious dude with no face. Let's not meet again.